So I want to just make it very clear that I often get students to look at x-rays, but I don't want them to give me a diagnosis. Just want them to phrase things in terms of anatomy and opacity. And I want them to use phrases like zone rather than lobe. And I want them to use things like costophrenic rather than um, you know, sulcus sign or whatever else. So I don't like the signs that some are sometimes are taught, and I prefer to just use some kind of word of where the opacity is based in the anatomy. So a version of what I use here to teach some of the anatomy is just a simple way of marking out where all the regular anatomy and blood vessels and all are. So in the middle is the heart. You've got the main places where blood vessels enter in, called the hilum, and then those blood vessels radiate out from there. So often if somebody has very prominent hilum and blood vessels radiating out from there, I would refer to that as a vascular opacity. Now, a vascular opacity is too much water in the blood vessels, and those blood vessels are the pulmonary arteries and pulmonary veins, and it's often associated with fluid overload and pulmonary edema, and those things tend to be symmetrical because inherently the back pressure is from the left ventricle, and so that back pressure will be symmetrically into both sides. So looking at this guy, without going through it in full details, if we're counting ribs, he's got, I think, 11 even, so he's not underinflated. We can see the cardio and costophrenic angles reasonably well, except on the left, and if I can find my little paintbrush, we'll see, there is kind of missing. So what we should be seeing there is black pixels between the diaphragm and the heart. So that line right there would be visible as black pixels, but we have a loss of the cardiophrenic angle on the left. Other than that, the hilum is here and here, and it does look a little bit like blood vessels radiating out. Now, in my experience, everyone in the ICU is fluid overloaded, so it's not much of a thing to say that somebody has pulmonary edema or fluid overload. But what we're definitely not seeing here is any obvious changes to the costophrenic angles. And the costophrenic angles, which is this section here and on the other side, let's draw it there and there, is nice and acute on this guy. And often I associate things in the costophrenic angle, or blurring or opacity of the costophrenic angle. I might associate that with fluid in the pleural space. Another thing we associate of fluid in the pleural space would be a visible and obvious horizontal fissure, which again we're not seeing here. So just looking at this guy's x-ray, he's well ventilated. He's probably a little bit too much, so we need to do some expiratory techniques with him. He has no endotracheal tube, but he was sputumy and therefore needs some secretion clearance techniques. So we go from there to, as I said, the donut of truth. And the donut of truth, this is just one slide from it, tells me that this man has significant pleural fluid. So we've got here what effectively is the edge of the lung, and then here's the inside of the rib cage, and where the lung comes to the inside of the rib cage up here, then that's good. Whereas down here you've got the edge of the lung and then something water density in the space between the lungs and the rib cage, and that would be your pleural space, and therefore he has very significant bilateral, almost 30 to 40% or maybe even more in places, loss of lung space to pulmonary edema. Not pulmonary edema, pleural effusions. Even I get this wrong when I'm saying it. So significant bilateral pleural effusions, as evidenced by CT. This is one thing I test myself on every time I have an x-ray and a CT done on the same day. I will go through the x-ray, I will do my best to work out the anatomy, I will come up with a diagnosis only for myself, which I write down, or just, if there's nobody else around, I just say in my head. And then I test it against checking the CT and test my anatomy. And I know I get it wrong 20% of the time. There's things that I don't see or things that I suspect are a problem when they're not. And so, as I called it, the donut of truth says this is most definitely epic bilateral pleural effusions, and therefore not really something he can cough out, but he was otherwise sputumy and had a very weak cough, so had some difficulty clearing. Anyway, hope that clears a few things up. Just use words like hilum, vascular opacity, costophrenic angles, and lobar opacity. I'll use some other pretty pictures for lobar opacity coming up. Thank you.